One option for your final project is to paint a landscape. Here we'll be painting a sky, mountains, and trees. The colors we'll be using for this project are lamp black, ultramarine blue, mauve, Prussian blue, cerulean blue, cobalt blue, titanium white, pale green, medium green, deep green, burnt umber, burnt sienna, yellow mid, and lemon yellow. We'll begin by painting the background sky. Here I'm using cobalt blue, and I'm mixing in a little bit of titanium white. For this project, leave the watercolor paper fastened to the pad so that your page doesn't wrinkle when you paint. To begin, use your brush and some clean water and wet the entire surface of the watercolor paper. Then apply the paint and leave some negative spaces to represent clouds. I'll continue to use some clean water just to blend it out and soften the texture. Now I'll add another layer of color. Here I'm using some Prussian blue, just to give it more texture and to darken up the top. I'll continue to use some clean water to soften the texture. I'll also go back in with a paper towel just to take off some of the excess paint and again add more texture. Once your sky has completely dried, we'll move on and we'll paint the background mountain. I lightly sketched it in for a reference. I made a wash using mauve, Prussian blue, and some water. I'll begin by painting the outline of that distant mountain. Then I'll go back in and use some water to blend it out. I'll use a little more paint and some water and just soften it. Now I'll move on and I'll do the mid-ground mountain. Here I've mixed some Prussian blue and some mauve. Just make sure it's darker than the value of the background mountain. Again, I'll start by outlining the mountain and then using water to soften and blend it. Let this step dry before moving on to the next. Now I'll mix a highlight color for the snow. Here I'm using titanium white and adding just a little bit of burnt sienna. Now establishing the light source coming from the top right, I'll paint in the contours of the mountain peaks. I'll keep this paint pretty thick, so I won't add water. And then I'll dry brush in one direction, so that the paint breaks off and adds texture. Then I'll add just a little bit of water and some white. I'll soften the bottom. Now I'll mix a shade color for the snow. Here I'm using cerulean blue and some titanium white. Keeping this paint relatively thick, I'll dry brush the opposite side of the light source to create a shadow of the snow. I'll use this color towards the bottom and then some water just to soften it and blend it. Here I'm using titanium white. I'm just going to highlight the edge of the highlight side of the mountains. Now we're going to create a row of evergreen trees in the distance. I'm mixing mauve, Prussian blue, titanium white, and I'm adding some water. Using this color, I'll establish a series of vertical lines, and I'll make them smaller towards the right, just to give the illusion that they're going off into the distance. Now, using these vertical lines as a reference, I'll block in some shapes to represent some treetops. I'll use a very small brush and I'll just dab the paint towards the top, just giving the overall illusion of evergreen trees. Once I've established the overall profile, I'll go back in, add some paint and some water to smooth it out. I'll go back and fine-tune some of the treetops until I'm happy. Then I'll wait for this step to dry before moving on. Now I'll mix some titanium white and a little bit of sky color. I'll add a bit of water and use the toothbrush to flick paint onto the surface. Don't be afraid to use a lot of spatter during this step. This step will help push back the mountains and the trees further into the distance. Once this step has dried, we'll move on and we'll do another row of trees using some Prussian blue and some black. And I'll add some water. Again, I'll establish some vertical lines and I'll create a profile of evergreen trees, making sure they get smaller towards the right. Then I'll use some water and I'll soften out the bottom. You will see that I also added some titanium white to these trees to make it look like there's snow on top of them. Now I'll establish the foreground using burnt sienna. I'll just add a few curves into it just to make it look like a beach or a cliff. I'll then go in and I'll mix some titanium white with burnt sienna just to create a highlight for the front of it. Then I'll use some burnt umber to create a low light, just to give it some dimension. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this area because most of it will be covered up. I'll also use that burnt umber on the ground just to give it more texture. Then I'll go back in with some black just to do some outlining. Now using a pencil or a Sharpie, I'll go back in and I'll draw the profile of the tree. If you're unsure on how to draw a tree, just Google some images and find the one that you like, and try to copy it the best you can. Now I'll mix the background leaves using deep green and ultramarine blue. Using a slightly bigger brush, I'll block in some shapes to represent leaves, leaving some negative space in between them. I'll use the same color and establish some shapes to the foreground. Then I'll wait for this step to dry before moving on to the next. Now I'll base in the trunk of the tree and the branches using burnt sienna. Now I'll mix up a highlight color for the tree. I'll use some yellow mid, some titanium white, and some burnt sienna. I'll apply this highlight to the tops of the branches and to the right of the trunk. Remember, the light source is coming from the top right. I'll use a small brush and I'll do a series of dashes just to give the indication that it's bark. Now I'll mix a low light for the trunk. Here I'm using burnt umber and some mauve. I'll use this color, I'll paint underneath the branches and on the left side of the trunk, facing away from the light source. Once the trunk is dried, I'll take some medium green and I'll paint another layer of leaves. Paint these leaves on top of the branches to make it look like they're in front. And also use this color on the foreground on the bottom where the grasses are. Now I'll mix a highlight for the leaf color. Here I'm using pale green, lemon yellow, and just a little bit of titanium white. I'll apply this highlight very sparingly, just to give some visual interest to the leaves where the light is catching. I'll also use this highlight color and I'll highlight some of the grass in the foreground. Now I'll go back and use the low light leaf color just to add some shadows and deepen the tones in the bark, in the leaves, and in the grasses. Now just to clean up the edges, I'm using a Sharpie pen and I'm outlining some of the grass, some of the leaves, and also the bark, and also the treetops in the distance. Going back in with some color pencils, a couple of blues, and a nice yellow, just to give texture and to create more interest. And that's it. You're done.